Donald Trump has a week to surrender to authorities in Georgia on a slew of criminal charges for his efforts to pressure the state's election officials to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election there. In addition to fraud and forgery, the former president and his 18 co-defendants are all charged with racketeering or RICO offenses, which are frequently used to go after mob bosses. For his part, Trump is responding like he always does by going after the prosecutors, who he's accusing of unfairly targeting him for political gain. Joining me to discuss the case and how it's been playing out in the media are Christopher Robertson, a professor of law at Boston University, and Susie Banikarim, editor-at-large at the Meteor. Thank you both for being here. Chris, the president has said that, the former president has said he's being treated differently than defendants in similar cases as his legal woes have piled up. You just co-wrote a piece in which you said that is in fact the case, but not necessarily the way former President Trump means. What's your argument?
Yeah. When you look at how criminal defendants in the United States and state and federal courts are normally treated, often their first contact with the court system is when police officers bang down their door, arrest them, and drag them into jail for interrogation and processing. So Trump has, in that regard, been treated with kid gloves, right? He's been allowed to stay at home in the comfort of Mar-a-Lago and litigate this case through his lawyers and only show up to court at a time of his choosing and sort of maintain his dignity. And so that's one big difference. But as this case unfolds, we're also seeing many others because, for example, the indictments that President Trump received were incredibly detailed, word by word, giving him notice on exactly what the prosecutors intend to prove in court. Normally, a criminal defendant gets none of that. They get a bare-bones indictment that just says the date on which the crimes were committed and states the elements of the offense. So here again, Trump has been given sort of the prosecutor's playbook of what he can expect at trial, which gives his lawyers a huge advantage in preparing their defense.
Do those things that you've just mentioned that differentiate the way he's been treated from the way defendants usually are in these cases, are they unavoidable given the fact that he is such a unique candidate, former president, currently the front runner for his party's nomination in the upcoming election cycle? Do prosecutors have a choice here when it comes to treating him differently?
I think they're bending over backwards to respect him and to give him a fair trial. And I actually think we shouldn't be trying to avoid that. That is the way we should be treating all criminal defendants. There's no reason we need to surprise them and do trial by ambush, that everyone should get fair notice of what the prosecutors tend to charge. And frankly, that's the way we do it in civil litigation already. So I think the prosecutors are doing the right thing in giving him notice.
But you'd just like to see him do it in other situations?
I'd like to see a lot of criminal defendants get that sort of chance for a fair trial.
Susie, you made a film about the way the national political press covered or tried to cover former President Trump's bid in 2016 called Enemies of the People. I'm curious, we're 7 or potentially 8 years on from the events that you looked at in that film. As you look at the way the media is covering Trump's escalating legal peril right now, do you see evidence that we collectively have learned lessons that we should have learned from the early years of the Trump phenomenon, or do you see us making mistakes that maybe we shouldn't be making anymore?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's a little bit of both, to be honest. In some cases, some lessons have been learned. I think you're less likely to see the cable network certainly take his events live in the way that they did in 2016. They covered him as sort of a joke for a long time, but gave him such a disproportionate amount of coverage. But there are exceptions to that. CNN did recently give him a live town hall for an hour, and I think he says so many patently untrue things when he is doing a live event that as journalists, it's not a great idea to just broadcast a bunch of lies unchecked. So in that respect, I think we are seeing some progress. I think where you're still seeing the print and TV media really struggle is how much coverage he deserves. Like, on some level, of course, he deserves coverage. He is the front runner of the Republican Party. He is likely to be their candidate. But on the other hand, do I need to know about his every mood and every move? I don't think so. The reality is we don't get that for Biden. because there isn't this kind of like breathless anticipation that people are interested in every sort of detail. And what that does is it kind of shuts out coverage of anyone else in the Republican field. So I do think it's a delicate balance and a decision people who make coverage decisions need to really be thoughtful about.
Chris Robertson, one challenge that I think we in the media face, whether we're covering Trump all the time or not, is conveying how the different legal charges against him, different legal cases against him stack up in terms of their strength and weakness. And this is something that I struggle with as a media consumer. I'm not sure I have a full understanding or the understanding that I should. How do you, as a law professor, how do you see the comparative strength of the different cases against him right now?
Well, so we have 2 state cases, one in New York and one in Georgia, and 2 federal cases, one in D.C. and one in Florida. And to me, I think the Florida case is like a steel trap. It is open and shut. If he did the things that the prosecutors allege, he has I would hate to have to defend that case. That's a very tough case for him for retaining these national security documents. Whereas some of the all 3 of the other cases involve sort of judgment calls on the part of the jurors, as well as judgment calls on the part of the U.S. Supreme Court, which I think is going to look at those cases with an eye for the First Amendment and the right of politicians even to lie without necessarily being prosecuted criminally.
Your assumption is that those cases that you just referenced, that they're all going to be heading to the Supreme Court one way or another?
I think they will be, all 3 of those cases. All of them will be appealed, but I think the Supreme Court is going to take the most interest in these cases that involve politicians lying one way or the other. That raises some really interesting First Amendment cases.
You know, when you made that prediction, I found myself sighing. I don't know if it was audible on camera or visible on camera, but the sigh is connected to the question I wanted to ask you next, Susie. One other challenge that I think the media faces when it comes to this continually accruing amount of charges against the former president is getting people to tune in who may be feeling completely exhausted by the coverage that we've been talking about here and who might also find it deeply depressing. In a way, I want to ask you 2 related questions. What is the best way for the media to make the public tune in if they're feeling exhausted or dispirited with this stuff? And isn't even the media's job to make the public tune in if the public has decided, you know, I think I'm good on this, I'm going to take a little break?
So I think the thing here is that it is really chaotic and overwhelming. No question about that. So I think it's just normal to not be able to follow all these different indictments and all these different things that are going on. There's so many players and juries and judges and lawyers. You're like sort of having a hard time keeping track of it. And of course, I do think it is the media's job to help, you know, sort through that noise and help you figure out what is worth paying attention to and what isn't. And what we've learned from 2016 and just covering Trump since then is that the reality is chaos always benefits Trump, because what it means is nothing sticks to anyone else and nothing sticks to him and everything sticks to everyone else. So when you look at the 2016 election, Hillary, it was just the emails, and that story really stuck to her, but he did something crazy every day. So it would be like one outrage to the next, and then no outrage really felt big enough to stick to him, which is wild when you think of what the outrages were, right? I mean, he was doing really outrageous things, but as consumers, I just don't think we have the ability to hold, you know, 100 ideas in our head at the same time. So I think what the media can do here to really make a difference is cover it less like a spectacle. You know, I don't know that we need, when he's going to the courthouse, a camera to follow him from Mar-a-Lago to the airport and then the landing at the other airport and then the drive. Like, there are decisions to be made here. And if you're doing that, it's really worth asking yourself why. Like, what is the public learning from watching that motorcade? Or is that just wallpaper because you need to fill television hours? And is that the right thing to do with a candidate like this?
I hadn't even thought of that coverage question. And now that you mention it, I can't believe I didn't think of it, because, of course, there are going to be outlets that are probably going to do that. And if you're a member of the public trying to keep tabs on this stuff, you've got less bandwidth for the more serious things if you're tuning into frivolous and non-essential stuff like what you just mentioned.
Right. It just feels like you're watching OJ make his way down the highway,
Yep.
right? It's like it turns it into a tabloid story instead of a serious conversation about a serious thing that's happening. Like, it is news that one of our presidential candidates and a former president is facing so many indictments. But if you treat it like a sensational tabloid story, that's how people will see it.
Chris, is there anything that you, given your background, would urge the political media to do differently when it comes to the coverage that we've seen in recent days and that we're going to see more of in the upcoming weeks and months?
Well, to that point, these indictments are obviously big news when they come out. But really the next big news is when the jury gets to see the evidence and the jury gets to make a decision. And so one thing we need to do is, A, wait for that, and it's hard to wait a year, and there'll be some motions filed and extensions of time and a lot of things that probably aren't really critical to the average viewer. But the jury trial will be, and I'm really excited for that next phase because we'll get a lot more information about the granularity. So following that and realizing that it's really not a battle between the prosecutor and the Trump team necessarily, it's really a decision for the jury to weigh the evidence. So I think we can recenter the jury in the coverage in an important way. The second thing I like to see is when reporters and news outlets really highlight the actual texts that you see, the charging document, the indictments itself, and sometimes maybe annotate them. It seems like to me sometimes the media gets really quickly into the horse race aspect of it without actually letting these historical documents speak for themselves.
When you say horse race, you mean Trump versus the prosecution?
Or even how does DeSantis respond to Trump being invited? I mean, both of those are it's important to have that context,
we do love
obviously.
That. Yeah.
But we are at a moment in history where you have an indictment. The document itself is so important, and I think should be allowed to speak for itself. And so I really appreciate when journalists link directly to it or annotate it or quote from it so that you can actually see the case on its own merits.
Susie, you get the last word here. The president, I keep calling him the president, the former president, Donald Trump, had indicated that he was going to hold a press conference next week in which he was going to, according to him, rebut the charges against him in Georgia. He's now said he's not going to do that, but there are indications he's going to attempt to counter-program the Republican primary debate that's going to be happening next week, which he doesn't seem to want to be a part of, although who knows what he'll do. One more media coverage question. If he tries to counter-program, as he put it, how should we in the media handle that?
Well, I mean, I think this is sort of going back to the idea of how much coverage do you give someone and his every move, right? We just don't need to spend so much time speculating. Is he going to show up? Is he not going to show up? It's been days of that already, and the debate isn't until next week. So what's the point of that? The point of that is just to make it so that he is the only person who's getting any attention ahead of this debate. There's talk now that his team is considering actually counter-programming his arrest against the debate, which is just a wild way to take all of the attention away from the debate. And we do make choices. We as media professionals can say we're not going to accept that sort of decision-making on his part. But, even with the press conference, the whole idea of the press conference was that he was going to present finally this evidence that the election was rigged. And we know that that's not going to happen, right?
Yep.
So now they're saying he's not going to do it, but now we've had days of speculation. Is he going to do the press conference? Is he not going to do it? And then, with him, you never know. So maybe he'll spring it on us on Monday. And that's all to sort of make it difficult to make these coverage decisions, right? Yeah. It's as an executive, you're just waiting and you're do we cover it? Do we not cover it?
Reporting every incremental step as it occurs.
But that's inside baseball. That's for us to be paying attention to. Why is that what we're conveying to viewers and readers? It's not that important what he's thinking. What's important is what he's doing. And that's what we should be covering in a really active way.
That's a very useful reminder and exhortation to pull back a little bit when it comes to covering former President Donald Trump. Susie Banikarim, Chris Robertson, thank you both for being here to talk about this.
A pleasure.